Welcome to Royal Haunts and Tudor Queens. Lady Jane Grey, or Dudley as she was married, though never officially acknowledged as Queen, was illegally offered the crown by her father-in-law John Dudley and Parliament. Dudley had been in control, getting rid of his enemies by using King Edward as his puppet. There are differing views as to whether Dudley actually killed Edward. If that was the case, his timing was very miscalculated, and it's more likely that he made every attempt to keep him alive as long as possible, and so causing more suffering than any child should have to endure. Having married Guildford Dudley with little say in the matter, in an arrangement between Dudley and her ambitious parents, Jane was expected to be Queen in name only, allowing her husband to take control as any obedient wife should. But Jane had different views. If she was to be Queen, she would be Queen with her husband no more than consort. It did not sit well with the people of London. Even though Henry had been a bad king and an even worse husband, there was his last will and testament, stating the line of succession should go to Edward, followed by Mary, and then Elizabeth, something that could not be overwritten by a mere child. Lady Jane Grey took up residence at the Tower of London, as was usual for the monarch before a coronation. But Dudley underestimated the support Mary had, not just the people of her own religion, and though there was the fear that Mary would return England to a Catholic nation, Protestants also stood by her legal right to rule. When Mary received a message that her half-brother was dying and to go to him at once, she set off for London, only to be intercepted with a warning that Edward was already dead, and she was heading towards a trap. Mary retreated as support gathered in what could turn into another long and bloody war. It may well have been that way if Dudley had found a strong male contender for the throne, but it was Queen pitted against Queen, and it wasn't just Mary but her mother, Catherine of Aragon, that the people remembered with fondness. Thinking Mary was seeking to flee the country, Dudley brought out the navy, but Mary had many chances to escape, both during her brother and father's reign. Dudley set out after Mary himself, leaving a fearful Parliament to reconsider the succession in light of Mary's support. And so Lady Jane Grey was Queen from the 10th to the 19th of July, when Mary was declared Queen, to great celebration. Going from Queen to prisoner, Jane wrote to Mary pledging her allegiance, and Jane would no doubt have been welcomed back to court had it not been for the ambitions of her father, who, gathering support, attempted to put Jane back on the throne, something that cost Henry Grey and his daughter their lives, as Mary finally had to admit that while Jane remained alive, the girl would be a threat to her position. Finally giving way to her advisers, Mary signed the death warrant, and Jane was executed by beheading at the tender age of 16. The same day her young 18-year-old husband was also executed. Jane is now said to haunt the Tower, in particular the White Tower, but there are other places that lay claim to her ghost. She is said to haunt Chambercombe Manor, as she is known to have visited the place. Bradgate Park in Leicestershire is another of Jane's haunts, this being her birthplace, though the house is now no more than ruins. Mary rode into London to much jubilation. It wasn't until after her death, when history tends to get rewritten, that she became known as Bloody Mary. She also had to deal with those wishing to put Elizabeth on the throne. Although Mary was flexible, giving her brother a Protestant funeral, there were those who were opposed to her religion and her foreign marriage, in the likes of Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger. Her world was turned around when her father decided to leave her mother in favour of Anne Boleyn. This most certainly attributed to her mother's death, and Mary was treated terribly after leading a life of heir to the throne. But she didn't transfer any of the resentment of Anne Boleyn towards her daughter, treating Elizabeth as a sister. Mary may have signed many death warrants, but was certainly no worse than Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, or any other ruler of the day. Reigning for 5 years with a marriage late in life to her second cousin Philip of Spain, the time to have children had passed her by. She made out her will, making Elizabeth next in line to succession. Mary, being the first true Queen of England to rule in her own right in a truly male-dominated world, made the succession of Elizabeth more acceptable. Mary died at St James's Palace, and her wish to be interred at Peterborough Cathedral alongside her mother was not granted. During her hectic ride to evade capture by Dudley and his men, Mary stayed with friends at Sawston Hall. The laughter that has been heard here in the past is thought to be that of Mary during happier days. The original house was burnt to the ground in frustration when Dudley's men found Mary had escaped them, but when she became queen she had a new home built for the Eddelstons, who continued to own the house until the 1970s. Elizabeth took her sister's place as queen, though she promised Mary she would take the country back to Catholicism. Instead, she persecuted them to the point that those who did not flee the country faced the threat of arrest and execution, forcing them to practice their faith in secret. The golden age of the Elizabethan era saw pirates as court favourites, bringing travel to the New World in a time of adventure. However, Elizabeth continued with many of the policies set out by Mary, making them her own. Elizabeth was also not averse to ridding herself of any potential claimants to the throne, but by the time of her death the only line left was through Henry VII's daughter Margaret. And so Elizabeth handed the throne to Scotland after centuries of England fighting to take control of those northern reaches. It was at Richmond Palace that Elizabeth lay in a state of stupor for several days, drifting in and out of consciousness. On numerous occasions it was thought the Queen had passed, as Elizabeth's ghostly form was seen drifting along the corridors, though this was more than likely an astral projection. Elizabeth I is said to hauntingly visit Tilbury Fort in Essex, where the Queen gave a rousing speech to rally the troops prior to the attempted Spanish invasion. This was a great day for England, as the Spanish fleet floundered, but this was more thanks to the weather than the men who came out as heroes. It's not only Elizabeth that can be found here, as it is thought that Tilbury is highly active with paranormal phenomena. Richmond Palace is all but gone, with only the gatehouse remaining, but it's said the messenger sent to give James IV of Scotland the news that he was also James I of England can still be heard, its shod hooves clattering on the cobblestone courtyard. Elizabeth also joins a list of ghostly entities that reside at Windsor Castle, the most prominent place to see her ghostly form being the library. The Tudors attract the most attention of all the royal houses, particularly Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, though it was a relatively short-lived dynasty of 118 years. Elizabeth was interred at Westminster Abbey beside her sister Mary, overshadowing her in death as she had in her reign of 45 years. And that is the end of the Tudors, making way for the House of Stuart, with just as much glamour and scandal as the Tudors could ever dish up.